It was close to 2 a.m. when I got the ping. The app said the pickup was about 10 miles out, past where the city lights bled into darkness. It was late, and I'd promised myself I'd head home after my last ride, but the fare was good, almost too good to pass up. Bills didn't care if you were tired, so I took the job, turned my car around, and drove toward the edge of nowhere. The road narrowed as I left the suburbs, streetlights giving way to the occasional flicker of a farmhouse porch light. The air outside was heavy with fog, blurring the edges of the world and swallowing the trees in thick grey tendrils. My phone's GPS guided me down a stretch of empty, cracked asphalt, where the sound of my tires seemed louder than it should have been. The pickup location was listed as Old Quarry Road, but I'd never heard of it. After a few minutes, the map directed me onto a gravel path that looked more like a forgotten driveway than an actual road. My headlights carved into the dark, illuminating gnarled branches overhead that twisted together like skeletal hands. I spotted her before I reached the pin on the map. A woman stood at the edge of the gravel, her figure barely visible against the dense fog. She was motionless, hands clasped in front of her, staring out into the void like she was waiting for something or someone. I rolled down the passenger window. "You call a ride?" She turned her head slowly, almost too slowly, and nodded. Without a word, she opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me. Her movements were stiff, deliberate, like every action was an afterthought. "Cold night," I said, trying to break the silence. She didn't respond. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window. A pale glow from the dashboard light cast faint shadows on her features. Her dark hair was lank and slightly damp, clinging to her cheeks as though she'd been caught in the fog for hours. She wore a simple grey coat, unbuttoned, over a dark dress. No purse, no bag. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my tone light. The app had listed the destination as a gas station back in town, but I wanted to confirm. Sometimes riders change their minds mid-trip. "Just drive," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I hesitated. It wasn't the first time I'd picked up someone who'd had too much to drink or was just plain weird, but something about her felt off. Still, I figured as long as the app was tracking the ride, I'd be fine. I shifted into drive and started back toward the main road. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, fading into the smoother hum of asphalt as we left the quarry road behind. For a while, the only sound was the engine and the occasional squeak of my wipers against the windshield. "Rough night?" I asked, hoping to draw her into conversation. She didn't answer. Her gaze remained fixed on the window, though it wasn't clear what she could see through the fog. It was like she was watching something beyond the glass, something I couldn't see. "Look," I said, glancing at her in the mirror. "If you want to change your destination, just let me know." "Okay." This time, she turned her head slightly, meeting my eyes in the mirror. Her stare was unnervingly direct, her eyes dark and unreadable. She didn't say anything, just nodded once before turning back to the window. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. We drove on. The fog seemed to thicken as we neared the outskirts of town, swallowing up the trees and buildings until the world outside the car was nothing but an endless grey void. The clock on the dashboard ticked past 2:30. My phone's GPS recalculated the route, suggesting an alternate road through a quieter part of town to avoid construction. I took the turn, and the road narrowed again, the trees closing in on either side. A sense of unease crept over me. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the late hour and the oppressive fog. But when I glanced in the mirror again, my heart skipped. She wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop in the middle of the empty road. My breath caught in my throat as I twisted around in my seat. The back seat was empty. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice shaking. But when I looked into the mirror again, I saw her reflection staring back at me. She was still sitting in the same spot, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the fog was playing tricks on me. I glanced back over my shoulder again, half expecting to see her sitting there, but the seat was empty. Her reflection remained. "Keep driving," she said, her voice soft but firm. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of the car, to run, but I couldn't move. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "What are you?" "Drive," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal before I even realized what I was doing. The car lurched forward, and I kept my eyes fixed on the road, refusing to look in the mirror again. The sound of the tires on the wet asphalt seemed impossibly loud, drowning out my own heartbeat. "Turn here," she said after a few minutes, her voice cutting through the silence. I didn't argue. My hands obeyed her command, turning the wheel onto a narrow dirt path that hadn't been marked on the GPS. The car jolted over uneven ground, the headlights illuminating thick trees on either side. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the woods. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You'll see," she said. There was a strange calmness in her tone, as if she already knew how this night would end. The path finally opened into a clearing, where the fog seemed to lift just enough to reveal a small, crumbling house at the center. The windows were dark, the wooden boards warped and rotting. It looked abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a ghost story. "Stop here," she said. I killed the engine, my hands still shaking. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the trees in the wind. I turned to face her, but the back seat was empty again. Her reflection was gone. A tap on the window made me jump. She was outside, standing by the driver's side door. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her dark hair blowing slightly in the wind. "Come inside," she said. I didn't move. My instincts screamed at me to drive, to leave her and the strange house behind, but my body betrayed me. My hand reached for the door handle, and before I knew it, I was stepping out into the cold night air. The door to the house creaked open as she stepped inside. The darkness beyond swallowed her whole, leaving me standing alone in the clearing. My feet felt rooted to the ground, but something pulled me forward, a force I couldn't explain. I followed her. As I stepped onto the rotting porch, the boards groaned beneath my weight. The sound echoed in the stillness, each creak setting my nerves on edge. The fog curled around the edges of the clearing, suffocating the faint moonlight. For a moment I hesitated, staring into the open doorway. The darkness inside the house wasn't natural. It was thick, almost tangible, as if the air itself was made of shadow. My chest tightened with a sense of foreboding, but some invisible pull urged me forward, dragging me past the threshold. The air inside was damp and cold, reeking of mildew and decay. My flashlight app cast a thin beam of light, revealing peeling wallpaper and warped wooden floors. The walls were covered in jagged scratches, as though something with claws had tried to escape or perhaps get in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the room. There was no sign of the woman. "Hello," my voice barely rose above a whisper. A soft sound echoed from deeper in the house, a faint creak like footsteps on old wood. I swallowed hard, shining the light toward the source of the noise. There was a hallway ahead, its walls narrowing like the throat of some great beast. Against every rational thought, I moved toward it. The beam of my flashlight wavered as my hand trembled. The floor beneath me felt unstable, as though the house were alive and breathing, ready to swallow me whole. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. From the crack spilled a faint, flickering light too weak to be from an electric bulb. It was warm and golden, dancing like firelight. I pushed the door open, and the sight froze me in place. The room was bare except for a large, cracked mirror that leaned against the far wall. A single candle burned on the floor in front of it, its flame casting erratic shadows across the room. In the mirror, I saw her. She stood in the reflection, her face obscured by the same damp strands of hair that clung to her cheeks. Her body was motionless, but her reflection tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, as if studying me. The figure in the mirror moved closer, though she didn't take a step in the room itself. "Why are you doing this?" My voice broke, barely audible. "You came here," she said, but her lips didn't move. Her voice echoed from the walls and the reflection at the same time. "You always come here." "What are you talking about?" I stammered, stepping back. The candle flickered violently, and the room seemed to stretch and distort around me. The walls warped, the scratches on them shifting into patterns I couldn't understand. The reflection in the mirror changed. It wasn't her anymore, it was me. But not me as I was now. The man in the mirror was older, gaunt, his face sunken and hollow. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with an unbearable terror. He was screaming silently, his mouth open in a soundless wail. "Stop," I whispered, turning away from the mirror. But there was no door anymore. The hallway was gone. The house was shifting, closing in around me like a tightening noose. I spun back toward the mirror, and she was there again, standing beside my distorted reflection. "You've been here before," she said, her voice colder now. "You just don't remember. But you will." The candlelight flared, filling the room with blinding brilliance. I shielded my eyes, stumbling backward, and when the light died, the room was empty. The mirror was gone. The walls were smooth, unbroken by scratches or marks, and the air no longer smelled of mildew. My heart pounded as I turned in frantic circles. The house was silent, too silent. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black, dead despite the full battery it had before. I ran for the door where the door had been. Now was just a wall, solid and cold to the touch. My breath quickened, panic setting in. From somewhere deep within the house came a sound, a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to anything human. It reverberated through the walls, growing louder, closer. And then I heard her voice again. "Run." The growl erupted into a deafening roar, and the floor beneath me buckled. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I sprinted down the hallway, or what was left of it, the shadows closing in around me. My feet barely touched the ground as I ran, the walls shifting and twisting like a living thing. I burst into the clearing outside, gasping for air. The house was gone. In its place stood an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and brambles. My car was still there, parked at the edge of the gravel path, but something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong anymore. I didn't care. I threw myself into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the clearing, not daring to look back. The fog followed me all the way to the main road. I drove faster than I should have, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The fog clung to the road like a living thing, swirling in the beams of my headlights. My pulse hammered in my ears, but even over the roar of the engine, I swore I could still hear it, a faint growl, rising and falling like distant thunder. The GPS had gone blank. The screen glowed faintly, displaying only a static map with no roads or markers. I tapped it uselessly, my hands shaking too hard to make any difference. My phone wasn't responding either, the battery inexplicably dead. Come on, I muttered to myself, glancing in the rearview mirror. And then I froze. She was back. Sitting in the rear seat, her head tilted just enough for me to see the pale curve of her cheek. Her reflection in the mirror stared straight ahead, her eyes meeting mine. I nearly veered off the road, slamming the brakes and skidding to a stop. My breathing was ragged as I twisted around to look at the back seat. It was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, her reflection was still there. This time she was smiling. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The sound echoed in the small space of the car, swallowed quickly by the fog outside. Her lips didn't move, but I heard her voice as clearly as if she were whispering into my ear. "You were warned, but you didn't leave." I don't understand. I gripped the wheel, the leather slippery beneath my damp palms. I was just doing my job. I didn't ask for this. Neither did I. Her voice was colder now, and the air inside the car dropped several degrees. My breath fogged the windshield, the moisture spreading out in jagged, unnatural patterns. Her reflection tilted its head, almost playfully, as if she were savoring my fear. "You think you're innocent?" she asked. "You always think that. But you were told to run." A flash of memory jolted through me, her voice in the house, commanding me to flee, the sound of that growl chasing me into the clearing. It wasn't a warning, it was something else. I gritted my teeth and slammed the car into drive, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog pressing in on either side. Every few seconds I glanced in the mirror, but her reflection didn't move. She just stared, her dark eyes boring into mine. The growling returned, low and guttural, growing louder as I sped up. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, behind me, above me, or maybe inside me. The sound vibrated through my chest, and I gripped the wheel tighter, willing the car to go faster. And then the headlights flickered. "No," I whispered, panic clawing at my throat. The engine sputtered, the dash lights blinking erratically. The growling was deafening now, drowning out every other sound. The car jerked violently, the engine cutting out completely. I wrestled with the wheel as the car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. Silence descended like a shroud, broken only by the soft tick of cooling metal. I sat there, frozen, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The headlights flickered once more before going out, plunging me into darkness. In the mirror, her reflection moved for the first time. She leaned forward, her face impossibly close to mine, though the seat behind me remained empty. Her lips parted, and I felt the chill of her breath on my neck. "You don't remember," she whispered. "Remember what I croaked. What you did." The fog outside the car began to churn, forming shapes that pressed against the glass, hands, faces, distorted figures that melted back into the mist before I could focus on them. My heart raced as the memories she spoke of remained stubbornly out of reach, my mind blank except for the present horror. The growling started again, louder this time, and the car shuddered beneath me. The shapes in the fog became clearer, more defined. One pressed against the driver's side window, its face a mass of shifting shadows. "You brought this," she said, her voice layered with something older, darker. "You invited it, and now you'll remember." The window beside me cracked, the sound sharp and violent in the suffocating silence. I screamed, throwing myself toward the passenger seat as the glass splintered and the fog began to pour inside like smoke. It swirled around me, cold and thick, filling my lungs until I couldn't breathe. Her voice was the last thing I heard before everything went black. "Now, you're part of it too." When I came to, I was lying in the middle of a road I didn't recognize. The asphalt beneath me was rough and cold, biting into the skin of my hands as I pushed myself upright. My head throbbed, and every muscle in my body ached as though I'd been dragged through the dirt. The fog had thinned, revealing a desolate stretch of road bordered by dark woods. My car was gone, the road behind, and ahead stretching into an infinite emptiness. For a moment I thought I was dreaming or maybe dead. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't in my pocket. My wallet and keys were missing too. All I had was the clothes on my back and the creeping sense that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. I stood, my legs trembling beneath me. The silence was absolute, no hum of insects or distant rustle of leaves. It was as if the world had been muted, leaving only the faint sound of my breathing. Then I saw the headlights. A faint glow appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached. Relief flooded through me. Another car, a chance to get out of here. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle slowed as it neared, its engine a low growl that sent vibrations through the ground. It wasn't until the car came to a stop a few feet away that I realized something was off. The headlights were too bright, almost blinding, and the car itself looked strangely familiar. It was my car. The driver's side door creaked open, but no one stepped out. The interior was dark, the windows impossibly black, as though the light couldn't penetrate them. A cold dread crept over me as I took a step back. "Get in," a voice said. Her voice. It came from inside the car, low and echoing, as if spoken from the depths of a cave. My body froze, my limbs refusing to move, even as my mind screamed at me to run. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You already have," she replied. The car's engine revved, the growl deepening into something almost animalistic. The headlights flared brighter, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. And then the car began to move toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the pavement. The car advanced slowly, its engine rumbling like a predator toying with its prey. "Stop," I shouted, my voice cracking. But it didn't stop. The headlights bore down on me, blinding and relentless. Just as the front bumper was about to touch me, the car vanished, the sound of the engine replaced by the deafening silence of the empty road. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving as I scanned the road for any sign of the vehicle. It was gone, as if it had never been there at all. But I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the fog, stepping onto the road a few yards ahead of me. It was her. She stood motionless, her pale face illuminated by a light that didn't seem to have a source. Her dark hair clung to her skin, and her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. "You can't leave," she said, her voice carrying over the stillness like a cold wind. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking with equal parts fear and anger. Her lips curved into a faint, almost pitying smile. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you deserve." "What are you talking about?" I shouted. "I don't even know you." Her smile faded. "You don't remember. But you will." The road beneath me began to shift, the asphalt cracking and splintering as dark tendrils snaked out from the ground. The sky above dimmed, the faint glow of the moon replaced by an oppressive darkness that pressed down on me like a weight. Images flashed through my mind, fragments of memories I didn't recognize. A hand gripping the steering wheel, headlights illuminating a figure on the side of the road. The sickening thud of impact, followed by silence. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That wasn't me. I didn't do that." Her expression hardened, and the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, the world dissolving into a swirling vortex of darkness and light. Her voice followed me, echoing in the void. "You did. And now you'll never leave." I landed hard on the gravel, the impact jarring me back to the present. I was standing at the edge of the same gravel path where I'd first picked her up, the fog curling around me like smoke. My car was parked nearby, its engine idling quietly. But something was different. The world felt heavier, the air thick and oppressive, and when I glanced into the side mirror, I saw her reflection sitting in the back seat, waiting. She smiled, and this time I understood. I opened the car door and got inside,